троцкисты и бухаринцы, товарищи судьи, этот право-троцкистский так называемый блок, верхушка которого фигурирует сейчас здесь на скамье подсудимых, это не политическая партия, это не политическое течение, это банда уголовных преступников.
The years under Joseph Stalin in charge of the Soviet Union were some of the bloodiest in the nation's history. Not only because of the millions of deaths caused by World War II, but also because of the terrible internal repression he ordered. The aim was to consolidate his political position by eliminating anyone who was suspected of being a rival. The number of victims of these oppressive policies was staggering. But Stalin did not carry this out alone. The NKVD, his secret police, was a key part of the purges. It was made up of the most loyal and savage officers of the regime, who did not hesitate to carry out even the most abhorrent tasks.
They form the backbone of Stalin's security state, and their duties are manifold. They are the firemen, policemen, clerks, border guards, judges, executioners, prison camp guards, security forces, spies, soldiers, and murderers in service of the Soviet Union's Ministry of the Interior, also known as the NKVD.
However, there was one such officer who stood out above the rest for the bloodthirstiness of his actions: Boris Róndos. His record, which spans more than a decade, is full of testimonies of terrible beatings, torture, and mutilations. He never showed even a hint of remorse until the moment when his luck changed. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Boris Róndos, Stalin's most brutal torturer.
Я думаю, товарищи, что выражу мнение всех здесь присутствующих и мнение всего пролетариата нашей страны, если скажу, что нужно этих гадов расстрелять.
Rodos was born on June 22, 1905, in what was then the Russian Empire. He was 12 years old when the October Revolution of 1917 occurred, which would eventually bring the Communist Party to power and lead to the creation of the Soviet Union. Due to the chaos that engulfed the nation, he was forced to leave school. However, he replaced this activity by joining the newly established Komsomol, the Communist Youth League. Here, he began his training as an officer, but he did not progress far. The dark character that would come to define him had already begun to emerge during this period. In 1930, he was expelled from the organization after being accused of attempted rape. This could have jeopardized his entire career, but fortunately for him, the following year he encountered a group seeking individuals with his characteristics. This was the OGPU, or the Unified State Political Directorate. It functioned as the Soviet secret police, and within a few years, it would become known by a much more infamous name: the NKVD. That same year, he also joined the Communist Party. He was transferred to Ukraine, where he was stationed for most of the 1930s. Although he had opportunities to demonstrate his cruelty towards common criminals during these years, they were not very active. However, his chance would come in 1936. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, had for some time already ordered the beginning of a political purge. He sought to eliminate all his rivals, both confirmed and potential, through imprisonment or, in many cases, death. Millions of officials, artists, writers, and Red Army officers met this fate. But also a vast number of innocent civilians, accused of sabotage against the Communist Party, were sent to forced labor camps known as gulags. Hundreds of thousands were also executed, often without even a prior trial. The organization responsible for carrying out these massive persecutions was the aforementioned NKVD. Under its leader, Nikolai Yezhov, they ruthlessly repressed the Soviet people, destroying countless families. In 1936, the bloodiest period of the repression campaign began, known as the Great Purge. The head of the secret police was so severe in his duties that these years were also referred to as the Yezhovshchina, or Yezhov era. Even the NKVD itself was not spared. A large number of its members were arrested and brutally interrogated. Many of them were accused of being foreign spies aiming to undermine the regime, but a large portion were completely innocent. To compensate for the numbers of personnel eliminated, several secret police officers from other regions of the country were transferred to Moscow. There was no doubt about their loyalty to the dictator and his regime. Boris Róndos was one of the fortunate ones who was brought to the capital. Although he was assigned a minor position, his big moment would come soon. By 1938, these indiscriminate killings had achieved Stalin's goal. His greatest political threats were either imprisoned or dead, and the population was terrified. No one dared to challenge the dictator. But even he felt that the purge had gotten out of hand. The innocent blood spilled was also causing global public opinion to condemn the actions of the Russian government.
During its mass operations, the NKVD widely utilized imprisonment, torture, violent interrogation, and arbitrary executions to solidify control over civilians through fear. By 1938, however, the oppression had become so extensive that it was damaging the infrastructure, economy, and even the armed forces of the Soviet state, prompting Stalin to wind the purge down.
For these reasons, Stalin decided to distance himself from the purge. The way to do this was to eliminate its leader. Nikolai Yezhov was arrested and accused of abusing his power to terrorize the people. In his place, Lavrenti Beria was appointed as the head of the NKVD, a name that would become widely known in the years to come. Rodos, who had demonstrated his loyalty to the Soviet leader, was promoted to lieutenant. His initial tasks in this rank involved the torture of his former comrades in arms. One of his early victims was an officer named Pyotr Zubov. Accused of sabotage, Zubov was brutally beaten on the knees with a hammer to extract a confession. But that was not the worst part. After such an assault, the charges against Zubov were dropped and he was released, but the damage was already done. Zubov could never walk again without a cane. And while, as previously mentioned, the Great Purge officially ended in 1938, this did not mean that the persecutions came to an end. In the following months, Boris Róndos continued to eagerly fulfill his role as a torturer. Demonstrating his talent for the job, he was primarily employed to extract confessions from former high-ranking Communist Party members. At no point did he hesitate while physically abusing those who had recently been his comrades. But the role that brought him fame, or rather infamy, was being in charge of interrogating his former boss, Nikolai Yezhov, in 1939. Shortly after his arrest, the beatings began. Despite the fact that the former NKVD head had issued torture and execution orders without hesitation, he could not withstand the blows for long. In just a few brief sessions, Rodos ensured that Yezhov signed every document presented to him. These papers included confessions to the crimes he was accused of. Many of these confessions were true, but many others were completely fabricated. Yezhov would end up being executed the following year.
Nikolai Yezhov was brought in for interrogation, and he was tortured, and he then admitted to having been an enemy of the people. He was a man who had been part of thousands of these interrogations, and he knew he would soon be executed. He claimed that he'd stolen government money and that he'd collaborated with the Gestapo, and he also admitted he was incompetent at his job. Then a closed trial happened, and at this he claimed his love for Stalin and claimed he'd been tortured to admit these charges that he was being found guilty of. He said when he would die, his final words he would utter would be Stalin's name, but he knew what was coming his way.
Meanwhile, Boris Ródos's reputation had already been cemented. Stalin and Beria, Yezhov's successor, knew they could rely on him to get even the most stubborn prisoners to confess their betrayals. Many disgraced Red Army men passed through the jailer's cruel hands, and almost all of them ended up in the gulags or buried in mass graves. A number of politicians, such as the leaders of the government of Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union, met the same fate. Some sources say that one of them, Stanislaw Kosior, endured beatings for hours. Furious, Rodos ordered his 16-year-old daughter to be taken to the cell, then sexually abused her in front of her father. In this way, he obtained her confession. Even the leader of the Komsomol, the youth league to which Rodos had belonged as a teenager, suffered from his torture. But civilians also formed part of the long list of his victims. The fact that he did not hesitate for a moment to apply the cruelest tortures against his own former colleagues and bosses spoke of the degree of inhumanity that Rodos had. But there is more. The famous writer Isaac Babel, considered by many to be the best in the Soviet Union, was also arrested in 1939. He was accused of terrorism and espionage, but he vehemently denied all these charges. But after 3 days, with numerous visits from Rodos in between, his fate was no different than that of thousands of others. He admitted his crimes and was sentenced to death the following year. Although he declared days before that his confession had been due to the torture he was subjected to, nothing changed the verdict. Years later, Rodos would be asked if he had ever read Babel's works. He simply replied, "For what?" After Yezhov's overthrow, although Stalin had denounced the excesses of the NKVD under Yezhov, we can see that his actions continued. What changed was that now defendants were required without exception to confess before being sentenced. This way, the local and foreign public had no way of declaring that they were massacring innocent people. Of course, many suspected that the victims were being forced to sign these documents, but this way their complaints carried less political weight. In March 1940, Boris Ródos was tasked with extracting a confession from Robert Eike, another high-ranking member of the Communist Party. His superiors gave him this job because the prisoner clung fiercely to his innocence, despite having already been beaten several times. Despite this, the man had already been sentenced to death, but Lavrenti Beria was personally seeking to make him collapse. The brutal jailer began his usual methods, but Eike remained steadfast. Frustrated, he gave him a long and utterly vicious session of torture, which went so far as to gouge out one of his eyes. No matter how much he suffered, the prisoner continued to declare his innocence. He was shot that same day, but Rodos and Beria were left without their desired confession. By mid-1940, World War II had already begun. The Soviet Union was not yet in dispute with Germany. However, it had already entered the conflict by invading Poland, which it did alongside Nazi forces. Tens of thousands of Poles, whether members of the military, political organizations, or just civilians, were deported en masse. Most were taken to gulags to perform hard labor without stopping to aid the Russian war effort. Boris Ródos was put in charge of prisoner transport in the city of Lviv. Around 300,000 people were expelled from their homes and imprisoned on Soviet territory, and many of them would die here. His superiors were very pleased with his work and promoted him to major the following year. In June 1941, Germany launched its massive invasion of Soviet territory. Millions of men were mobilized to confront the Nazi machine, and vast resources were diverted to stem its advance. But internal repression continued unabated. Generals who did a deplorable job were arrested and accused of treason, even though they were often simply following Stalin's orders. Anyone who showed even the slightest hint of anti-patriotism risked being branded a spy or saboteur. So Rodos returned to his old role as jailer and torturer. In this way, he was spared from fighting on the front lines, charged with eliminating Stalinism's supposed internal enemies. In 1943, he was even promoted again, this time to colonel. And in the meantime, his dirty work continued.
Alexander Beloslutsiev, the head of the Komsomol's organizational department, when being interrogated by Rodos, asked him to be taken to the bathroom to urinate. Rodos told him, "Take a glass and urinate." He did so, and asked where to put the glass. Rodos then grabbed the glass and forced it to his mouth, shouting, "Drink, you shit in human skin, or testify."
There is not much information about Rodos in the years that followed. Germany was defeated in 1945, but the Soviet Union was already preparing for a new conflict, this time against one of its former allies, the United States. During the early years of the Cold War, political persecution in the territory continued. Lavrenti Beria's NKVD was now after those accused of being collaborators with Western capitalism who sought to undermine communism. Even in the early 1950s, it seemed that a campaign against Soviet Jewry was being planned. For Stalin, they and the Americans were plotting to bring about his defeat. Fortunately, this purge was never carried out. The Soviet leader died of a stroke on March 5, 1953. Immediately, an internal struggle began among the highest-ranking members of the government to determine who would take power. Among them was Lavrenti Beria, still firmly at the head of the NKVD, which had become known as the MGB, or Ministry of State Security. But the ultimate victor was Nikita Khrushchev, head of the Communist Party in Moscow. Wanting to separate himself from the figure of Stalin, the new Soviet leader denounced the personality cult built around him and the terrible persecutions of his own people.
The critics include Premier Bulganin, his predecessor Malenkov, and Party Secretary Khrushchev. Khrushchev and his colleagues tell the delegates that for 20 years the party has suffered in all its work from one-man rule. Now they announce collective leadership has been restored and wider party democracy is promised.
Beria was arrested shortly after his political defeat, and in December 1953, he was found guilty of the same crimes he had accused his victims of. On the same day of his sentencing, he was executed. He met the same fate as the two previous heads of the secret police. Boris Róndos might have been tasked with obtaining Beria's confession, just as he had with Nikolai Yezhov more than a decade earlier. However, by 1952, he had been expelled from the MGB at a time when Beria had lost influence and could not keep him in his position. Instead, he was in charge of an anti-aircraft detachment in a city in Ukraine, in a position with little action. Nonetheless, when Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin and Beria, this torturer did not escape notice. Shortly before the arrest of the secret police leader, Rodos was imprisoned by the new Soviet regime. He was accused of obtaining false confessions through terrible physical abuse, which often led to the mutilation of prisoners. There were obviously countless pieces of evidence and witnesses who could point to him as guilty. Not only former comrades, but also the few victims who survived his torture and escaped death took the stand and provided testimony. The evidence was irrefutable. Knowing this, Rodos tried to excuse himself by claiming he was merely following Lavrenti Beria's orders. According to him, he had been a blind instrument used by his superiors, but had always been loyal to the regime. He also protested that he was not the only officer who had beaten prisoners and that he was being used as a scapegoat. His defense can be summarized by the following phrase: "I thought I was carrying out the party's orders." Although this was not only true, but the judges were aware of it, it did not signify his innocence. After the verdict, Rodos remained in prison until February 1956. On the 25th of that month, during a famous speech by Khrushchev in which he spoke about the crimes committed by the Soviets during the 1930s, Rodos's name was mentioned. The leader referred to him as a vile person with the brain of a bird and completely degenerate in his morality. He denounced that such individuals had been in charge of deciding the future of thousands of Communist Party members and countless others. Just one day after this speech, Rodos was sentenced to death. Although he tried to appeal for mercy, arguing that his innocent children would be left without a father, his pleas fell on deaf ears. On April 20th, 1956, Boris Róndos was executed. For the abominable crimes he had committed, execution was even a lesser punishment compared to the harm he had done. Thus died one of the most brutal torturers in the entire history of the Soviet Union. We've reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think that the argument of following orders justifies the innocence of the accused? Leave your answer in the comments box and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.